So the oration, what do we do it for? It's a reflection on critical contemporary issues impacting our nation that are driven by the introduction of advanced technologies into our society, which is something we talked about at our panel session, and delivered by an eminent, prominent Australia who is skilled in these areas. And to provide thought-provoking comments to question the status quo, to challenge politically correct perspectives. And the overall goal is to make Australia a better informed society. Paul Shetler. So it's the first time I've met Paul, it was tonight, but we've spoken on the phone. So tonight's oration will be delivered by a globe-trotting all-rounder, so to speak. Paul's background is diverse, to say the least. He's a native of Cleveland, Ohio. And would you believe it, his mother was a techo, a lab manager. So, of course, Paul majors in art history at the University of Columbia in New York City. Sort of makes sense. Clearly, Paul did not major in history, as he failed the basic question when I put it to him: who was the first president of the United States to visit Ohio? And he flunked it. He didn't know. Of course, everybody knows it was George Washington. And Paul had to make it to Melbourne in 2018 to find out this amazing piece of trivia. After graduating in 1989, Paul took himself off to Italy for 4 years chasing art history, but lo and behold, returned to New York City some 4 years later, firmly ensconced in the IT industry. You can ask him later about how he found this epiphany. In New York, he entered the world of banking IT, rising to be a CTO at the Public National Bank, now part of HSBC. And then he crossed into the dark side, joining Oracle in 1997, leading a team of IT architectural designers dealing with global transaction systems, something that Oracle has focused on for many years since. My daughter works for Oracle in this area, so right today. Then Paul chanced his arm after being enticed to the west coast of the US in 2001, joining Netfish, who I've never heard of because it was soon swallowed up, and that left Paul nowhere. So he joined none other than Microsoft in London. Talk about the dark side, my God. And this was focused on the financial services sector in Europe, Middle East and Africa. Sounds a very familiar road for many of us who've travelled when in vendor world, right? He had a few years at Swift, the well-known global financial transaction service company, before rejoining Oracle in London in 2008. Paul obviously enjoyed the large systems challenges at Swift and Oracle, and he enjoyed it so much he was fascinated enough to transit to the UK government in 2012, where he felt he could make a major impact with large-scale systems. He built a large team to scale up systems that could deliver real services for large numbers of British citizens. Keep in mind, David Cameron was the PM at this time. So now to the relevance of all of this. Why did Paul come to Australia in the summer of 2015 to establish the Digital Transformation Agency? I'm sure Paul will throw more light on this during his oration, but suffice to say, recently departed PM Turnbull wrote an interesting article in the Guardian newspaper about innovation some years back, which piqued Paul's interest in the land down under. It took some persuasion by a number of parties in Canberra to entice him to make the big call. As it turned out, it was a highly politicised, highly visible job, and one with very high expectations. Having made his home in Sydney when Paul left the government at the end of 2016, he spent a year as an expert in residence at the Stone and Chalk FinTech Hub, and today Paul is co-founder of two startups, one based in Sydney and the other shared between London and Singapore. I am looking forward to hearing some of Paul's reflections on what works, what doesn't, and why, in this complex digital world we all find ourselves in. Please join with me in welcoming Paul Shetler to deliver the 2018 Pearcey Oration.
Thanks very much for that. So my name is Paul Shetler. I'm really glad to be here because normally when I give these kinds of talks, it's not to practitioners. And my understanding is that Pearcey and an awful lot of the people in this room are practitioners of technology. And so that makes all the difference to me. And I'm hoping that you'll take everything I say in that light. And an early thing to get out of the way is, obviously, I'm not, I have like you pointed out, the strangest British accent you ever heard in your life. I'm a foreigner. And I think Sandy once said that, you might want to tell them that sometimes you say provocative things. So I'm just going to say that. Everything I'm saying, however, is my decision to stay in Australia. So I left government in 2016, and I love it here. I moved here from London, and after spending 14 years in London, coming to a place where people were smiling on the street, where the sun was shining in what is the middle of winter, dead of winter, and it's a blazing blue sky, and you've got sun, what's not to love? Australia's also got an incredible, just general quality of life, and I think it's got tremendous possibilities. So everything I'm going to be saying is, so how can we actually maximize that? One of the things that was discussed earlier on the panel, we talked about things getting faster and faster. Everything is moving faster. Everything is hard to understand. We don't know what's going on. It's all so fast. And there's a term for that. It's called acceleration. A lot of people have been talking about acceleration lately. And one of the quotes that I want to throw out with to sort of set this tone right is this. From an essay, and the author is saying, anyone who wants to work out what they think about accelerationism better do so quickly. All right? Better do so quickly. And when people ask, what is this speed up? Is this something new? Not really that new, right? You look at this chart, world GDP over the last 2 millennia, you already notice that around 1500, things are starting to speed up, right? Merchant capitalism, through exploration of the Atlantic, and then it really kicks off with the Industrial Revolution. And then with the Information Revolution, it's just like a straight line upward, right? It is going very fast. Population is increasing, lifespans are increasing, knowledge is increasing, wealth is increasing, and it's a consistent circle of positive feedback. The normal negative feedback loops don't work. That's what characterizes modernity, and that's what characterizes acceleration. Now, you can look at growth on the internet, and it seems, this doesn't look like it's a straight line, but actually it's about 10% year on year. We've got 3.4 billion people on the internet right now, and it's not just people going online, right? You've also got any number of devices. That's what we talk about when we talk about Internet of Things, IoT. And they are generating more data than ever before, all of which can feed lots of different things, including AIs, right? You couldn't have artificial intelligence and machine learning without the internet, because you wouldn't have the data to actually train it on. All this is happening in real time. And it means that distance doesn't matter. It means that borders matter much, much less, and that anyone is addressable. Everyone is network addressable, maybe multiple times, but at least once, right? You're all network addressable. So this is a market we've never seen before. It's unparalleled in speed and scale. It took Walmart about 54 years to get 260 million customers. As an example of acceleration, it took WeChat 6 years to get to 750 million. So those are the kind of changes we're talking about. That means that competitive pressures are also getting very different. We talked about competitive pressures here a little bit, and maybe the lack of them, but I'll be going into a bit more detail about that. My feeling is this incredible compression of time and of pressure means that you kind of recreated a Darwinian world through high technology. And if you look at the internet marketplace, it is truly red in tooth and claw, right? The fast-moving, nimble, smart competitors, and they are competitors and not collaborators, win because they eat the slow-moving, ponderous, maladapted, older forms. And it's not only commercially. That's, I think, one of the very important things to keep in mind when we talk about acceleration and when we talk about this change. It's not only commercial. It's in 4 major areas. The first one is narrative control, right? It used to be that you had a couple of newspapers and you had a couple broadcasters, and they would control the narrative. And that's all you knew, because of course you have all kinds of interactions in the world, but you don't know everything that's happening. You have to depend on other people to tell you what's going on. And if the few gatekeepers are telling you this, it's this, which is why propaganda was so easy to do. Now you've got a situation where everybody's a broadcaster. And obviously on things like Twitter and YouTube and Facebook, you see that. And of course, you know, Twitter and YouTube and Facebook are all kind of like, oh my God, now what do we do? And they're starting to crack down and they're trying to censor and so on and so forth. And all that does is it moves traffic to other platforms, like Discord, like 4chan, like Instagram, like Telegram, whatever. Because people route around. Key thing about modernity is people figure out ways to route around. That is the thing. You cannot control, right? In the 1990s, people talked about information wanting to be free, and it was sort of like this utopian vision. Actually, information has become free. Information has become free, and now people are saying, well, I'm not so sure I want it all. Maybe I want somebody to curate it for me. But nonetheless, that's the world we've made, and it's not stopping. So that's the first thing. And I think as a result of that, this is sort of byproduct of that, status has also changed. Who owns status? Status used to be given by credential, a university degree. That granted status. That was your qualification. Now, if I was hiring somebody, if I was hiring a developer, the last thing in the world I'd be looking at is a university degree. I'd want to see the repo on GitHub. I'd want to see their code. I can see that. I don't need somebody else to tell me. I don't need an argument from authority to tell me that something is good or bad. I can examine it myself. And we're starting to see this trend in general industry too, right? I love this headline. Apple, Google, 13 other companies that don't require employees to have college degrees, because why would they? If you're working in tech, and I learned this back in 1997 when I was at Republic National Bank, actually 95, back around then, people coming into my office and telling me, well, you should hire me because I'm a Microsoft certified software engineer. I threw them out. I told them to leave. I didn't care about their paper. I want to know what they could do. I want to know, what is their character like? Are they capable of understanding things really quickly and learning? Because everything was changing so fast that learning about, Microsoft's little protocols or IPX, SPX wasn't really going to help you. Not in the bank we were at, because we were throwing those out the window, and we were moving everything to IP. So that kind of stuff, this is the world we live in right now, right? Those credit credentials don't really work that much. There's a huge spill-on effect when you've lost narrative control and you've lost credential control on politics, right? So, everybody's familiar with Brexit, right? But let's look at what else, Trump. You've got Kurz, you've got Orban, you've got Modi, you've got Duda, you've got Farage, you've got Salvini, and you've got Jeremy Corbyn. Not a single one of these people and not a single one of these political events could have happened 5 years ago. They couldn't have happened. The narrative control was different. The information sources were different. This is what's freaking everybody out. Okay, so we'll leave this alone, but this is background. I think everybody needs to keep this in background when we talk about what we're talking about. Now, looking at commerce and getting back to one of the earlier questions about what is a company? What kind of marketplace do they operate within? Let's look at a few interesting quotes. So back in 2015, John Mackey, who was the CEO of Whole Foods, said, Amazon Fresh is going to be their Waterloo. Why would anyone go to Amazon for fresh veg? Go home, Amazon. You're smoking dope. Go home. Whoops. Gee, what happened? 18 months later, they got bought for $13.7 billion. And it wasn't really because they wanted to sell fresh veg, but it's because Whole Foods had a great distribution network, which they wanted. Part of Amazon's logistics buildup. Now, back in 2016, you had Terry Lundgren, who's the CEO of Macy's, saying, and I love this quote, we've got stores and consumers are going to return, particularly when they buy apparel online. I mean, of course, that's right. That's a great value proposition, right? You can have a place to return your clothes. About 6 months later, Macy's announces it's closing 68 stores and cutting 10,000 jobs in the United States. This is fake news because over 100 stores. It's over 100 stores. Amazon's killing these guys. And even closer to home, we had this gentleman, Jerry Harvey, saying, don't worry, Australia. Do not worry about Amazon. Go to sleep. Your eyelids are very heavy. Do not worry, right? Because they haven't even bought a block of land. And everyone knows, with government planning permissions, it'll take forever, right? You buy the plot of land, but then you got to build a warehouse on it, right? No, they just bought a huge warehouse. They didn't need to buy the plot of land. So, this sort of shows how Amazon operates just with one part of their business. This is just the Amazon marketplace. This is not even the profitable part of their business. This is the part of the business where they still lose money on. And what does Amazon say? They say, well, our vision is to be the Earth's most customer-centric company, to build a place where people can come and find and discover anything they might want to buy online. Anything. Just think about that. That's a pretty amazing thing to say. Anything? Really? I'm afraid it is, right? Afraid it is. So one ring to rule them all strategy. Now, most people, when they think about Amazon, don't really think about all these different things. Amazon is not just a marketplace. Amazon, I don't know if a lot of people working in IT, I'm assuming are very familiar with AWS. Pretty much any time you're using internet, something coming into your browser is coming from a server hosted on AWS. Maybe not everything, but at least some of it is, right? Because that's the way the internet works, that's the way the web works. It's not all coming from one place, it's all being aggregated and pulled together. That's the beauty of HTTP and HTML. It's how you marshal information. Some of that information is being marshaled off of Amazon servers. Amazon took a page from Google, and they're number one, tied for number one, in retail search. And they're monetizing it the exact same way that Google is. So they were trying to out-Google Google on retail. Not a bad strategy, right? If you sometimes go into Amazon and you wonder why certain things are coming up when you do a search on retail, that's why. That's because Amazon's selling that service. Amazon Prime, their subscription service, which I think they're opening up here pretty soon, very popular in the United States, basically same-day delivery. And what they do is they have to have some kind of way of delivering stuff, but they offer it to get you the exact same day. They had bundled it with their video offering, Amazon Prime Video. They realized it didn't make a lot of sense, so they just unbundled and they have two separate things. Amazon Prime Video is going hammer and tongs after Netflix, right? Hammer and tongs. They got some amazing stuff on there. In fact, if you're interested in original programming, it's probably better. And how do they deliver stuff that last mile? Well, they have this thing called Amazon Flex. So it's just suspiciously like Uber, except that this is literally Uber for delivering products, right? You've got a driver, you want to get something delivered, Amazon will do that for you, right? And oh, by the way, they'll deliver stuff that's not only bought from Amazon Marketplace, they'll deliver anything for you, because that's how Amazon works, right? Any one of their products will work with anybody else's stuff. They have an integrated stack, but they also open it up to everybody. That's how they get the benefits of both horizontal integration, vertical integration, and competition. And because people driving cars probably need insurance, they've got an insurance offering. Now, Amazon have also come out and said that they're going to, well, they haven't officially come out and said, but the rumor is pretty strong that they're going to be, getting into banking services very quickly. That'll be an interesting challenge for Australia. It's going to be a really interesting challenge, being beaten on both retail and banking. It's going to be a challenge. Now, there was a meme that was going around really recently, and actually even at the World Economic Forum, somebody was actually saying this, which is shameful. But saying, I think everybody's familiar with this one. Uber, the world's largest taxi company, owns no vehicles, right? Facebook, most popular media owner, creates no content. Alibaba, most valuable retailer, has no inventory. And Airbnb, largest accommodation provider, owns no real estate. I think we've all heard this one before, right? Fake news. Totally fake news. Totally. I don't know how they got away with saying it at WF. Uber's buying 24,000 cars. And they'll be self-driving. People who are driving those cars won't have jobs soon. But Uber will still be able to deliver stuff. You'll still drive you around. Self-driving. Facebook is spending $1 billion on providing original TV shows. And I think that number's probably gone up recently. Alibaba is spending $2.6 billion on physical stores. And Airbnb is building branded apartment buildings. So what we're seeing is companies moving from what was sort of viewed as a sort of virtual, internet-y kind of world, and taking everything they learned about customers, everything they've learned about delivering products, and saying, let's do it in the material world as well. Boom. So again, the question of, are you a software company or not, I think just became a bit more urgent. Amazon is letting you know, and so is everybody else in this business, that they are indeed coming after pretty much everything you do. It's a sobering thought. Now, sometimes people say software is eating the world. I haven't ever said that before in a presentation, so just forget I said that. But let's look over this. In 2011, if you look at the top 10 companies by market capitalization worldwide, you see kind of an interesting mix. You got Opel, you got ExxonMobil at the top, PetroChina, Apple, ICBC, Petrobras, BHP, Billiton, and so on and so forth. And it actually looks very old economy, doesn't it? I think it does. This year, what's changed? 7 of the top companies in the world, worldwide, are digital companies. 7 out of 10. in only 7 years. That's a lot. And a couple of them are Chinese, Tencent and Alibaba. There will be more Chinese companies coming up very quickly because, again, they don't collaborate, but they are very good at competition, extremely. Now, let's take a look at that in Australia. This is, I think, also from 2018, might be from 2017, but it's still pretty representative. And if you look at it, Australia's share market is incredibly concentrated. So the top 10 stocks in the ASX are almost half the total value of the market here. And that means these top 10 companies here are kind of really representing what's going on, right? You see mining, banking, retail. Mining, banking, retail. You don't see not one digital company in the top 10. Not one. And if you were to say, oh, yeah, that's because Atlassian's overseas, they still wouldn't make it to the top 10. Atlassian wouldn't be in the top 10. So it's an interesting point to keep in mind. So let's go back to acceleration. Back to acceleration. One of the theories, one of the predictions of accelerationism is that expectation you'll be too slow to deal with it coherently. And yet if you fumble the question it poses because you're rushed, you're going to lose. Perhaps very badly. It's hard. Life is hard. So now let's think about what's going on here. In my view, motion is relative. So if the world is moving really fast, you're kind of moving like this, the same. You could also view it as you moving backwards. An economy which is very heavily on extractive industries and not very heavy on extractive industries and a fire economy, finance, real estate, that kind of stuff, not generative, is really vulnerable, right? When I first came into government, that was one of the conversations we were having, with my minister at the time, was the vulnerability of the Australian economy. We wanted to build up a digital sector so we could actually do something because we didn't want to become Venezuela or Russia when all of a sudden nobody wants what you're selling. Something to keep in mind. Now, assuming that Australia does not accelerate, what do I think could be the case? The first thing is obviously stagnation. So all the talk about secular stagnation, I think it's really a risk for Australia in terms of stagnant wages and in terms of income disparities. I think it's a real risk, and it's one that leads to everything else. Increased tribalism. And by this I don't mean only political tribalism, it's political tribalism, racial tribalism, religious tribalism, all this kind of stuff. I've never seen politics anywhere in the world as tribal as Australia. And I've lived in Italy, I've lived in Spain, I've lived in France, Belgium, Netherlands, Britain, and the United States. Never seen anything, right? This last week was insane. But the whole time I've been here, it's like that. Political instability. Everyone talks about, we need stability for growth, but there's a lot of instability already, right? I mean, just look at this. Timeline of prime ministers. Talk about acceleration. Wow. Bang, right? 6. Count them 6. And notice when that happens, by the way. There's a little bird there. I'm not saying that Twitter is responsible for that, because I don't think Twitter is. But all the journos are on it, right? It is where narratives start to get spun and developed and spread. And it contains multiple echo chambers. So if you look at fragmentation and balkanization, you can look at how social media works, and it encourages it. It absolutely does. Another risk is surveillance, increased surveillance. Living in the UK, one of the reasons why I love Australia is that it's not as heavily surveilled as the UK, right? In the UK, wherever you walk, you've got CCTV watching you. It is really creepy. You get used to it, but you are watched every minute of your life on CCTV. It's kind of insane. And then ultimately, loss of freedom. I think these are the risks that the country faces. And by loss of freedom, I don't only mean individual freedom. I also mean political freedom, and I don't just mean freedom of who you vote for, I mean sovereignty. I think it's a real issue, it's a real issue that needs to be thought about. How do we kind of get here? I have some ideas that I've noticed while I was working in government, but also with private sector companies, primarily banks, but also insurance companies, et cetera, since I left government, and noticed a certain set of things which are different to what I saw in the States and in the UK. So all three Anglosphere countries, but there are different things. And one is sort of an extractive mindset. The fact that mining is so important, and agriculture, right? There is a certain idea that you have restricted access to a set of things, and you're going to set up all these legal mechanisms around who can get access to it. Even the idea of social license, which is touted as being a very progressive idea, is also all about rent seeking. Really, it is. Let's be honest. It's a weird thing. It colors a lot of thinking, both on the left and the right. De-skilled workforce, it's a problem, right? On technology, current digital practice. If you walk into a government agency or department, it is, you do see, you have a lot of technologists, but most of them aren't current. But they aren't actually keeping pace, right? They don't do continuous delivery. They don't do continuous integration. They do all manual testing. Everything about the way they work is kind of strange. You talk about shifting things left, and they don't know what you're talking about. One big problem is this. So we've got an industrial policy here where, you've got the 4 pillars on banking. 4 pillars on banking. Now, how do you reconcile 4 pillars on banking with we love fintech? I don't see it. They're contradictory. Fintech is inherently disruptive of existing banks. The whole idea of fintech is those guys are going to eat the banks. So how is fintech going to be successful if government policy is to keep those banks, those 4 banks, propped up as long as they possibly can? And then you see the same thing in retail. You see the same thing in other industries too. It was one of the things that I first learned when I first came here. I was given lessons by people in terms of what to expect, and one of them was extreme cartelization. Well, that's very difficult then to have sort of a semi-free market and then talk about innovation, because why would you innovate when you've got no competition? You've been very cozily cutting things up. Why innovate? And it's a general unwillingness to make bets on the part of the government. I'm not talking about private sector here. I'm talking about the part of the government where the government should make bets. Government says, no, we don't want to make bets, and they walk away from their responsibility. And I know I'm going on, but I'm going to throw one more thing out here, which is government grants. The last thing in the world a startup needs, in my view, is this government grant. The first thing in the world a startup needs is a customer. Startups need customers. They need to know if they got a product. They need to know if the product's meeting a market need. Is it or not? A government grant doesn't tell you that. And if you look at a lot of the startup ecosystem, it is all based on extracting grants from government and paying rents, literally floor rents, at incubators and startup hubs. That is not a startup world. That's something else. Finally, to some extent, I've certainly seen this in government, invoking lions of times past, captains of industry from times past, who don't really have a lot necessarily to say about this world. And yet, so we shouldn't necessarily always be asking their opinion. So before we go into what will work and what we should do, we just want to get some snake oil out of the way quickly. First one is cargo culting. Right? It's a problem. The idea that you can create a market by adopting some of the trappings that a real functioning market would produce as a result of its functioning is backwards. The idea that you create a real estate scheme is going to create new businesses. Really? Wow. There's lots of real estate in Australia. There's lots of construction in Australia. That's not creating new startups. And I think we need to be really careful about this kind of stuff because it's fundamentally not serious. Hackathons are great, are brilliant, but they don't necessarily form new businesses, right? When I was in government, we did a lot of these things. And I've seen a lot of my private sector customers do this as well. The problem is they get ideas from hackathons and they don't know how to productize them because their business models don't fit, right? They can't develop them because they don't have the skills in-house. They can't change them because their processes internally don't allow them to change things rapidly, right? They got to wait forever for procurement. Their governance is based on waterfall. They don't actually do prototyping, and they don't want to do any risk. Well, then how is that going to help you out? You're going to get an idea and turn it into a fossil immediately. Blaming universities is not helpful. It's not helpful. I remember so many times being told, the problem is we don't have this pipeline from the universities to industry. It's not the university's job to take some ideas for products and act like a product manager and hand it off to the private sector. A real private sector, an entrepreneurial private sector, would go banging down doors to get IP if it's valuable. Banging down those doors and doing whatever is necessary, not expecting a prof to figure out, how to turn some idea into a business. It's ridiculous. Lifelong learning is not going to be a solution for the problems that Australia has, because a lot of people aren't capable of it. We have to be honest. People who are in their 50s, late 50s, who might not be exceptionally gifted, are going to have problems with the idea of constantly changing their career. How do they do that? With what kind of intellectual abilities? That's something which people who are kind of on the high end of cognitive abilities can talk about that comfortably. But the vast majority of the population can't. And I think that was one of the big problems that we had with the previous innovation, ideas boom thing, right? It didn't actually tell people what they were going to do. So when their job disappears, what's going to happen? It's a problem. Nor will yet another government study. I think we talked about that, right? Stop them. We've had enough of them. We know. So, gone through all this stuff. Had to get it off my chest. Sorry about that. What will work? First thing, look. Be bold. No more half measures. No more pussyfooting. No more flim-flam. Be bold, Australia as a country is pretty inspiring to somebody like me as an American, right? People came here 1770, traveling around the world, all the way around the world, and they find a place. And they start settling it 18 years later. It's already been settled by people who came here 50,000 years before that. People who live in Australia have been pioneers for a long time. They've been taking incredible risks for a long time. It's time to recapture some of that, I think. I really do think so, right? Just be bold and look beyond the Anglosphere. Almost all discussions I ever hear about digital are about the United States, United Kingdom, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and then maybe as a token non-Anglo country, Estonia. You know what? You've got this huge country up north, which is doing amazing things, growing incredibly quickly. And they actually operate on very different principles than we do, called China. The PRC is going gangbusters. And no one's actually looking at them to see what they can learn from them, really. So let's talk about that. The first thing, before we go there, I think to avoid the kinds of inevitable problems that are going to happen when we really try to take this forward and really try to re-gear the economy, there has to be some kind of an accord between labor, capital, and government. There just has to be. You can't tell people that they're going to lose their jobs and expect them to vote for this. We saw that. We saw what happened in that election. It was ridiculous. It was a slaughter. And they won't even use the word innovation now because they're terrified of it. Forget about being afraid to use innovation. Just solve the problem, right? Make it so that it's not going to be, figure out some way that labor doesn't get destroyed by this. Their fellow citizens. It seems to me obvious. I'm not necessarily saying UBI or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying there should be an agreement, right? And if, as an example of what I'm talking about, there was a session at Stone and Chalk with Chris Bowen, who was the labor shadow treasurer. I'm not sure if he still is or not now. And we were talking about Fourth Industrial Revolution, and we were talking about future of work. And somebody said, so what are we going to do about this? Because everybody's sort of like, well, let the market figure it out. Saying let the market figure it out means let some people go hungry. And Chris wasn't able to say anything, which to me is astonishing because he's labor. You'd think a labor person would take that on, right? Now look at a country far away again, in Europe, Italy, elected a populist government, but they're taking this issue on. And they're saying, well, actually, people whose livelihoods depend entirely upon platforms and who are, by definition, very precarious in their employment, and then therefore their ability to participate in society is precarious, we have to change that. So we're going to force some kind of an agreement between labor and platform providers, whether that's on wages or benefits or something else. And I don't think the details have all been worked out yet because they're going through the process, but they are actively doing so. And I think we need to think along the same lines. I don't know what those end solution will be, but there needs to be a good faith effort to reach that. And this is where I think we can learn from the Chinese and other places, and the UK, China and the UK. Use government for certain things, not for everything. So government is the only entity with enough scale and agency to act on a national level and in the national interest. And so I actually want more government and less government at the same time. I think right now we have a weird world where we have a passive government that rewards past models, squelches new ones, is afraid to act, and yet has a heavy regulatory burden on industry. Don't understand that at all, right? Lots of regulation and very little action. What I prefer, actually, is reverse that. And I'll talk about what I mean. First, use government as a national VC. That's what China does. That's what China does. China decides what moonshots they want to go for. China decides what industries they want to dominate. And then they go hell for leather on that. They fund it. The government may invest in certain cases, or it finds other ways of funding things. They push it as a national priority. And they actually do exactly what we did in the United States. When we were building out our highways, when we were building out our infrastructure, when we had our space program, and all of that fed right into Silicon Valley. Because Silicon Valley wasn't invented out of nothing. It was done on the back of military and defense spending, purely. Those engineers, what do you think they were doing, right? Do this. We need to make some decisions. Where do we want to play? There's lots of things we can do, right? Is it going to be in personalized medicine? Is it going to be in other areas of health? Is it going to be in agri-tech? Is it going to be in space? We have a space agency. We have a space agency, we're not funding it. Don't bother with it if you're not going to fund it. Do it seriously if you're going to do it. I really think we need to think very seriously about the government acting and taking a very active role in this regard. Also, as a purchasing lever. This is something I had conversations with the PM all the time. We, as DTO, or federal government, let's put it that way, buy tons of stuff. We're the largest single buyer in Australia, right? We can affect and improve. Buying Australian, favoring Australian companies in the technology sector would be such a boost, right? Our problem is we have a free trade agreement with the United States. And I know that's an issue because when I was in DTO, I was always told, no, Paul, you can't do this because of free trade. No, Paul, you can't do that because of free trade. No, Paul, you can't do it. Well, maybe we need to rethink that. Now, we built a DTO marketplace, and there was, I think, most recently, the number I was told was like $220 million transacted through that. That's good, right? That was part of the reason we did it. But the government can do a lot more on this. And it's going to spend the money anyways. So it may as well spend it and support Australian business. And use government as an exemplar to drive skills development, right? When I came in, one of the problems we had was the talent pool was very broad, but it was shallow, right? So you had product managers and you had designers and you had coders, but you didn't have a really critical mass anywhere, right? And it was very difficult in Canberra because there was very few skills there, even though there was a massive need. And the government was outsourcing everything, and it just didn't work out, right? Government needs to take ownership of the services it offers. It needs to insource that and do exactly what the British government did. Insource it, hire the people, train them up on the proper way to do things, and have a cadre within government who can take care of this, who then also rotate back out and go into private sector, and all of a sudden you've got an awful lot of people in the private sector who know how to do things properly. And again, if you look at London and you consider, when did London become like the digital capital of Europe? It became the digital capital of Europe after they started fixing government on a massive scale and taking it very, very seriously. It wasn't it wasn't dribs and drabs, it was huge. And at one point, that was a place to work if you were in digital. And now London has more startups than pretty much anywhere else. Now, getting back to the question of where you buy, renegotiate. Today, news just today from the United States, NAFTA, Trump has renegotiated NAFTA. They're changing the name of it. And they basically boxed the Canadians out. And the Mexicans in the US are a new deal. And it's evidently better for both the United States and for Mexico. So people are happy about that. Just because a deal exists doesn't mean it can't be renegotiated. And for government, for us, for Australia to really move forward, I think it's going to have to, because otherwise it loses that huge lever. Now this is where I go to the other side. I would say drastically reduce regulation in Australia. Although I do believe government needs to be a very interventionist in certain areas, the regulatory burden is incredibly high. It just is. Do what the United States did. Every single time you want to pass a new regulation, decommission 2 others. They've actually done more than 2 others. But I mean, just go crazy on that, right? Because the industries where you see the most growth and where you see the most innovation are the ones where there's the least regulation. That's why tech grew up so fast. Tech grew up so fast, it was hardly regulated at all, right? Social media, was it regulated? No, that's why it grew. The areas that are heavily regulated, like finance, where's the innovation? The only kind of innovation that usually exists in finance is making it so you can't understand what the product is obfuscation, right? Derivatives, things like that, where you really didn't know what they were. That was financial services innovation. Because of the fact that it's so heavily regulated, I think we can do better now. Foster a competitive mindset. When I came to Australia, and ever since I've been to Australia, Australians are very friendly and good. I've heard constant praise of collaboration. Always. It's like the only thing people want to talk about is collaboration. I have never heard yet in a forum, and I've been here for 3 years there, people say, you know what, we need more competition in Australia. Competition is good. Gosh, it is. Of course it is, right? Because the Chinese companies and the American companies coming here, they are born and bred on competition, right? If you look at the Chinese startup businesses, they are hyper-competitive. They will do anything they possibly can to do each other in, including things which are probably very unethical, right? When they grow and get big and they enter into this market here, and we're talking about playing patty cake, it's not going to end well. So we need to realize competition is a very good thing. It drives innovation, right? Necessity is the mother of invention. And the usual necessity is competitive pressure. We can't have innovation without competition. It's massively important. I know, so I said something at a previous forum that didn't actually put it in these words, kill, don't collaborate, but you know what? I like them. So to some extent, I'm almost serious about this. It is better to take out a competitor or to aim to take out a competitor than to try to sort of cozily collaborate and then, how does that really work? Before I close, and this third quote, accelerationism is old enough to arrive in waves, which is to say insistently or recurrently, and each time the challenge is more urgent. And I believe it is very urgent. And even, in the earlier sessions we had today, everyone was basically saying that in different ways. I'm just saying it a bit more pointedly. Like all waves, I think that this is the chance for Australia to master the wave. I really do. I think Australia, you see incredibly smart people here, incredibly enthusiastic people here, and I would say also incredibly good-natured people here after having lived in the UK. I've never seen, walking down the streets, people smile in the UK. I do see it here. There is something about Australia which is great, and I think this is an opportunity for Australia to move from defense to offense, from rent extraction to wealth generation, and therefore to a more prosperous Australia for all people, all of its citizens. But that's only going to happen if you increase wealth, right? Just sort of paring back and splitting things up even more from existing stuff isn't going to be so helpful. That's kind of where I'm going to leave this now. Thank you.
So we've got time for a couple of questions. Paul, for the record, I'm a capitalist.
Yeah.
Moonshots, I like that term. Just a bit of a preamble, because I'd like to ask you what you think some of the moonshots could be for Australia, because by default, some of the things we were talking about earlier on this afternoon about, we've got these things called growth centres and CRCs, and they were sort of almost like trying to pick winners, and I don't think in general that they've worked. What do you think could be some of the moonshots, and how would we go about identifying them and then executing on that?
I think one of them, about a year ago, I was meeting with a number of people who were working in the medical field. It seemed to me that there was a lot of interest in personalized medicine, in actually really going deep into genomics. There had been a lot of work already happening in Australia in that regard, but there was a question of actually getting cooperation from the government in terms of getting access to the data sets for longitudinal data that would allow people to actually do more interesting stuff. And that was, impossible to do for dead people, whatever, it didn't matter. And that's too bad, because actually the Chinese are already decided they are doing that. And it's, if you don't do that, then you're going to lose out. I think personalized medicine and genomics are one of them. Agritech, obviously, just because of what we do here. But I would like to see more specifically into purely digital space, in the software development space, in the services development space. And I think there's no reason on earth why Australia can't do that. If Israel and Estonia and South Korea can become powerhouses in that space, there's absolutely no reason why we can't either.
I agree. So we got, anybody like some questions?
Okay, so I'm happy to call that. I'd like to challenge the deregulation question. So I see a lot of bad things happen when industry is deregulation.
Yeah.
We've currently got the Banking Commission, finance deregulation has been producing really horrible behaviour. Another example with TAFE education and private education, you say you'll have private providers providing education. It costs a lot of money and produce really bad outcomes. So how do you see it? So again, blanket deregulation doesn't seem to produce good outcomes if you're trying to produce social good. Certainly education is one area.
Yeah, I'm not saying blanket deregulation. I'm saying if you're going to do a new regulation, retire two. So if you look at, this is the same thing as if you look at laws. How many things are passed every year in Parliament as a law? How many laws are ever repealed? Very few. After a certain point, regulation just becomes a dead hand. And it actually, in many cases, most people spend their time trying to figure out how to get around it, how to route around it. Just simplify it. Simplify it. There's many ways you can reduce regulatory burden. One is you can make regulations more clear to understand. You can simplify, you can reduce redundant ones, and so on and so forth. I'm just telling you, from putting up a marketplace, just the amount around that was ridiculous. So I can't imagine that every single regulation that's on the book is required.
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. Paul, really enjoyed your talk. Interested in your views on how you can make change.
In what regard? Where? In government or in business?
Yeah, well, probably both.
Yeah.
So I really love the solutions that you put forward and totally subscribe to them. And so, given your experience in our political system and you've been here in our business environment, we've been collectively trying to make change, and I think we need to move faster than we currently are. So, and a lot of people in this room have tried. So, just seeking to what can we do differently just to shift people's thinking, either at a public sector level or at the political class. So
There's a few things. One is just get the ideas out there and actually take them seriously, because politicians do respond to that. If you look at changes in Western economies, from the 1970s onwards, and you look at sort of Mont Pelerin Society and people like that, they had a huge effect, right? But the way they did that was by just popularizing ideas at first. So that's one thing. How do you change an organization? It might not sound terribly democratic, but you usually wind up putting somebody in charge of it who is dead set on doing it, and come hell or high water, that's what they do. I saw that. I've seen that. Those are going to always wind up being the successful cases. In many cases, I think organizations just won't change. So you have to allow the market to take care of that. That's part of the problem. You have to make sure you have a market that actually functions, so the companies that aren't doing the right thing, they can go out of business. They can be beaten by the competition. Just one of the reasons why I don't really like the 4 pillars policy. So I think you just need to have a competitive market as well.
So you're just following on from that point. So the change has to happen, but we have this continuum of time, and time we don't have. So I know it's quite a politically sensitive issue, but do we need to ingest our economy or our culture with overseas knowledge and experience to accelerate the need for change, or do you think we have it here to be able to drive that and to put that pressure on government to say deregulate and to do that? Because I don't think we're not ready for globalisation. I think we've totally been ignorant of it, partly from our remoteness. We've probably played a little bit ignorant to our now disadvantage. But I think that there are a lot of issues there that we don't have time to just to wait for cultural change and and demographic change to make that happen. So you just need to ingest it and bring new people in.
Well, that's what we did at DTO to some extent, right? We brought people in from the UK and elsewhere. But, for that to work, though, that was just, we could do that to seed things. But we couldn't do that to actually change things themselves. We had to train up public servants. We had to change the way the public service itself worked. And that meant more than just bringing in people from the outside. We had to change their minds. We had to change their policies. We had to change their incentives and everything else, right?
And how many years ago was that?
That was a couple of years ago, right?
2 years ago.
Yeah. So we had, and were we successful? Well, no, not as nearly successful as I'd like to be, actually, right? Because then the political winds changed, and all of a sudden everything we were doing was like, well, who cares about that? That's what happens. So I think what you really have to do is you've got to put huge pressure on politicians. I don't see how else it's going to work. I don't see how you're going to change national policies without politicians having huge pressure being placed on them.
If they're not getting pressure, if they're not getting, they're on the global market, if they're not getting pressures from their peers, other prime ministers, presidents of other countries, if they don't see it globally, that's going to happen if they don't do something.
But why would they? Those countries are competing. The idea that
competition's good. It's better to compete and collaborate, have that competitive mindset.
No, but what I'm trying to say is countries do compete. Countries do have interests. Countries do compete. They're not necessarily going to be saying, oh yeah, we're in competition with you. Just like Mexico didn't say to Canada until today, oh yeah, we made a deal with the United States without your, we kind of lied to you.
No, I understand that. I don't make it public, but you've got to act competitively, you've got to behave.
No, I agree with you, but I think the problem is, until you have political leadership that is willing to accept that, then it's very, very difficult, right?
One more question.
Paul, fantastic presentation. There's so many threads I could pick up here, but I think the one that's most critical, in my view, is the learning that has to happen. We look to offshore oracles to give us knowledge, but we don't actually pay attention. We don't learn from them. We need to learn from ourselves. I often ask the question, what portion of our business and government leaders are competent to lead us into a digital future? I'm going to shift that question to, have we got some business leaders and some government leaders from whom we can learn? Mm-hmm. And if we have, how do we bring that to the fore?
I think you have. The question is, are they so busy doing their own business and taking care of their own thing that they want to share? We tried setting something up in Sydney with a bunch of CEOs from different industries, from retail, from banking, you name it, software, a bunch of them. This was done about a year ago, Sun and Chalk. And, it was interesting. The conversations were quite fascinating. Some guys there were absolutely up for it, and they knew what was happening. And other ones were kind of looking to the startups to solve everything. And no, we'll let them do it. The startups will solve everything. We're just doing our own stuff. In a world where you had a functioning, market where older companies that just don't want to move will just be dragged under, then that would have not been so much of a problem because nature would have taken care of it. I think that's the real issue. But in government, yeah, you do have some people. The problem is, unless there's an outside voice which is loudly saying, this is what needs to happen, how are they going to get support? And how do you start focusing attention their way versus somewhere else?
Let's talk after.
Okay. Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you.
A small gift. You told me you like red wine.
I do.
It's a good drop.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Everybody, please, a round of applause.
Thanks very much. Cool.
Thanks, everybody. One last thing before we go. We're very delighted to participate in the Digital Innovation Festival these 2 weeks. And Pearcey's got one more effort, Friday week. I don't suppose any of you will be there, but we're holding a session in Ballarat at the university on the heritage in Australia, because there's a lot of good stuff that's happened in Ballarat over the years, and we're going to take a team up there led by Dr. Peter Thorne and others to share and get their feedback on what we need to do in Victoria and to preserve our heritage. So everybody, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and to the Victorian Government for sponsoring us to put on a pretty good show. Thank you.